Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Speakers on the Square event. My name is Michael Denkinson. I'm president of the NYU Alumni Association. And on behalf of the Alumni Association, I'm pleased to welcome all of you here this evening, and that would include NYU trustees who are in attendance, Alumni Association board members, faculty, students, alumni, parents, and friends of the university. This is our 10th Speakers on the Square event, which is an event that is sponsored by the Alumni Association. And we're very proud of how the prior 9 have gone, and I'm sure we will continue with number 10. While this is not a movie theater, I just want to remind you, if you could, if you have cell phones or any other electronic instruments, if you could please turn them off, it would be much appreciated. Speakers on the Square was conceived by the NYU Alumni Association to welcome our alumni back home to Washington Square and provide them with the opportunity to hear from some of the university's most illustrious alumni and faculty. The lecture series is made possible through the generosity of alumni who are very dedicated to the university, as well as friends of the university. I'd also like to mention to you that another event that will be occurring on October 23rd in Washington Square, Alumni Day, which is a full-day event on Saturday, October 23rd, is one we hope you'll come back to campus again to enjoy. Materials are out, and you can register online if you would like to visit the NYU alumni website, which is www.nyu.alumni.edu. This evening's event, we are truly honored to have our esteemed speaker, Dr. David Oshinsky. Dr. Oshinsky is a leading historian of modern American politics and culture. He's the 2009 Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professor at New York University and a Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the NYU Department of History. He also holds the Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. Austin is a little different than New York, but I think in speaking with Dr. Oshinsky, he truly enjoys, and this is, I guess, his third fall here at New York University. His books certainly are ones which have notoriety, and they include A Conspiracy So Immense, The World of Joseph McCarthy, which is a New York Times Notable Book of the Year publication. A book called Worse Than Slavery, which won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Distinguished Contribution to Human Rights. And Polio, An American Story, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History. Currently, Dr. Oshinsky is working on the medical history of New York City, which I think all of us will find to be very interesting when it is ultimately completed. Tonight's lecture is entitled Mississippi Burning, Bringing the Killers of the Civil Rights Movement's Most Infamous Murderers to Justice. In the late 1990s, Dr. Oshinsky was sent to Mississippi by the New York Times to help investigate case files to see if he could unearth any new evidence or information regarding the Mississippi burning case. This evening, he will share with us the story of that experience and what he discovered during his time in Mississippi. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Oshinsky to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. This is a kind of different speech for me and a much more personal one. I'm not going to talk to you about a book that I wrote or research that I'm currently doing. I'm going to talk to you about an event that occurred in my life in 1998, my one and only foray into investigative journalism. In 1964, I was a student at Cornell University, and I remember recruiters coming up to the Ithaca campus to ask us to go to Mississippi during Freedom Summer 1964. And Freedom Summer was going to be a way in which college students from around the nation would go down to what was clearly the most racist and segregated state in the country and try to register African American voters and push for other civil rights measures. It was extremely dangerous. Mississippi was filled with a large number of Ku Klux Klan members. It had a local and state police force that was dominated by the Klan. And J. Edgar Hoover had made it very, very clear to the Freedom Summer people coming down that they would get no federal protection. Hoover said, in fact, it's not my job to wet nurse young kids coming down to try to change the South. So this meant that when you went down, you were pretty much on your own. And I, at that time, must admit to you that I did not have the courage to go. I thought it was going to be extraordinarily dangerous. I thought we would be unprotected. And I simply made the decision, as did the vast majority of college students, not to go down there. But a fair number did go down. And on the first day of Freedom Summer, on June 21st, 1964, 3 civil rights workers disappeared. They were, as you know, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. Michael Schwerner was a Cornell graduate. I did not know him, but I knew of him. And he had gone down early in 1964, before the summer, to organize a freedom school in Meridian, Mississippi, with his wife, Rita Schwerner. It was an incredibly dangerous job. And what he did not know at the time was that he had been targeted for assassination by a man named Sam Bowers, who was the head of the Mississippi Klan. Schwerner knew it was dangerous. He actually told his father, Nathan Schwerner, "I am a marked man." But he had no idea that he had literally been marked for death. When Schwerner got down there and began his freedom school, one of the young African Americans in Meridian who came to the school and became kind of an arm into the black community was James Chaney. And James Chaney became inseparable from the Schwerners. And then early in June of 1964, Schwerner and Chaney drove to Oxford, Ohio, where the Freedom Summer volunteers were sort of getting their marching orders, and they came across Andy Goodman. Andy Goodman was supposed to go to Vicksburg, Mississippi, but they talked Andy Goodman into coming down to Meridian. And he was in the state of Mississippi for 1 day before he was killed. The 3 civil rights workers went back to Mississippi from Oxford, Ohio, and the first thing they did was to visit a burned-out church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, about 20 miles to the north in Neshoba County. The church meant a lot to Mickey Schwerner because he was going to try to use it as a freedom school around Philadelphia, where he would train African Americans in literacy and try to get them to vote. And that is clearly the reason the church had been burned. So what we know happened, because once they disappeared, Lyndon Johnson literally demanded, that J. Edgar Hoover get off the dime and invade Philadelphia, Mississippi with FBI agents and try to seek the truth. And within 3 days of coming down to Philadelphia, Mississippi, the burned out car of the 3 civil rights workers who disappeared was found in a swamp. And it was clear to Hoover, it was clear to LBJ, it certainly was clear to the families of the 3 civil rights workers that they had been murdered, but their bodies were nowhere to be found. And what the FBI did in the summer of 1964, as Freedom Summer was evolving elsewhere in Mississippi, was simply to round up logical suspects, harshly interrogate them, and spread a lot of money around Philadelphia, Mississippi to try to find out where the bodies were buried. And indeed, 6 weeks later, as many of you know, the bodies were found in an earthen dam just outside the city limits of Philadelphia. And that, in some ways, solved part of the case, but really opened up a whole series of new questions. What the FBI found was the following. Sam Bowers, who was head of the Mississippi Klan, had tried to woo Mickey Schwerner up to the Philadelphia area so he could be killed. And he did so by bombing the church, knowing that Schwerner would go up there. What is really extraordinary and so horrific is that it seems pretty clear that Cheney and Goodman were collateral damage. They just happened to be with Mickey Schwerner in the automobile. And after the 3 young men had visited the burned-out church, they were arrested for speeding on the way back to Meridian by Deputy Cecil Price. They were thrown into jail. And what Price did was to phone the head of the local Klan, and this is a name you should remember for a few minutes because I will talk a lot about him later, Preacher Edgar Ray Killen. What a name. Preacher Edgar Ray Killen. Price held on to the 3 civil rights workers in the jail. He called up Killen, and Killen put together a posse made up of Klan members. And when the posse was ready, Cecil Price let them out of jail, let the 3 civil rights workers out of jail. And as their car headed back to Philadelphia, carloads of Klansmen followed them with Cecil Price in the front car. And they began to chase them. The speeds reached over 100 miles an hour. James Cheney, the African-American, was driving. Why he pulled over, we don't know to this day, but he did pull over. Finally, the 3 men were taken out. They were brutalized. They were shot at a place called Rock Cut Road, just outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, and their bodies were buried in the dam. The FBI, in that summer, put together an extraordinary case against 15 Klan members, including Cecil Price, Sam Bowers, the head of the Klan, and the preacher, Edgar Ray Killen, the head of the local Klan in Neshoba County. They turned the information over to the state of Mississippi, which refused to prosecute on murder charges. There was no way the state of Mississippi was going to. These guys were heroes down there. There was no way they're going to prosecute. But they also turned it over to federal authorities, and 15 of these Klan members, if you can believe it, were brought up on federal charges of violating the civil rights of the dead workers. A trial was held in federal court in Mississippi in front of Judge Harold Cox, who was a known racist. Cox was the college roommate of Senator James Eastland. I don't know if that means something to many of you, but Eastland was sort of the most important segregationist and racist in the U.S. Senate for decades. And the trial was quite extraordinary. The FBI had informants who testified at the trial. A couple of the Klan members turned state's evidence. And the defense, amazingly, put up this type of defense. They asked, isn't it true that Mickey Schwerner was a draft card burner? Isn't it true that he was a Jew from New York City? And one question actually coming from the defense attorney was, isn't it true that Mickey Schwerner asked blacks in Meridian to sign a pledge saying that they would rape at least one white woman a week? Judge Cox, who was a segregationist, was so appalled by this question that he said, who framed that question? He said to the defense lawyer, where did you get that from? And Preacher Killen proudly raised his hand. To make a long story short, about half of the Klan members, 7 of them, were found guilty on federal charges of violating the civil rights of these workers and were sentenced to short terms in federal prison. About 7 of them were acquitted, and 1, the preacher, got off on a hung jury. The jury actually was 11-1 for conviction, but one secretary, a woman in Jackson, Mississippi, said that she simply could not send a preacher to jail. So he got off. He wasn't acquitted, but he was not sent to jail. Judge Cox, and I will mention these words, and they are deeply offensive, but I will say them anyway. Judge Cox, in talking about what happened, said, I think justice was done. These men killed a nigger, a Jew, and a white man, and the sentences are fair. He didn't realize that Andrew Goodman was also Jewish. He actually killed a black man and 2 Jews, but Cox got it about as good as he could get it. And there, basically, the case lay. State was not about to file murder charges, although there's no statute of limitations. A few of the men went to jail for a few years, and they reintegrated themselves into life when they got back in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and that was it. But then, in 1998, a bombshell hit, and that was the bombshell that brought me to Mississippi. In 1956, following the Brown versus Board of Education school desegregation decision, Mississippi set up what was called the State Sovereignty Commission. And the State Sovereignty Commission had been set up to protect the sovereignty of the beloved state of Mississippi against federal intervention. On one level, it just put out all kinds of ridiculous propaganda saying how wonderful segregation was and how blacks and whites both loved living under it. But on another level, it set up what can only be described as the most amazing and effective informant system known in any state in the United States. In other words, they paid lots of money to have various individuals infiltrate every meeting in every town in Mississippi to try to figure out who was for civil rights. And if they found out who that person was, they would then terrorize that person. That's what the Sovereignty Commission was really all about. In 1977, the Sovereignty Commission is abolished. And whatever records there might be are sealed for 50 years. And just a few years later, an archivist wandering through the back of the Mississippi State Archives in Jackson comes across hundreds of boxes and realizes that indeed there are amazing files here, that the Sovereignty Commission files have not been destroyed. They're there and they're active. And once this happens, groups like the ACLU and other civil liberties and civil rights groups sue to have these files opened. The problem with these files is they present tremendous privacy issues. And by that I mean the following. They are loaded with all kinds of information given by informants, which may be true or they may be outrageous. So-and-so was sleeping with so-and-so. So-and-so was a communist who did this. So-and-so said this to so-and-so. In other words, there's amazing amounts of innuendo in there. But on the other hand, there are also important facts that could lead you to who were these informants? How much did they get paid? Whom were they spying upon? Finally, in 1998, a federal judge opens these files, and with some restrictions for living people who are mentioned in the files, but the files are open. And I decided that I really wanted to go down as an historian and have a look at them. What do they say? What is in there, and what might they tell us about Mississippi burning? Is there anything in these files about Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman? I had an interest in Mississippi because one of the books I had written was called Worse Than Slavery, was about basically crime and race and punishment in the state of Mississippi. And I had spent 5 years in Mississippi, and in a bizarre way, I had come to really like the place. It had an amazing pace of life to it. And, this was a state that in 1960 and 65 had said segregation forever, integration over our dead bodies. But when I got there in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the hotels were integrated. You had whites serving blacks in restaurants. I mean, things had really changed. There were bizarre things as well. To get into Jackson, you had to drive over the Ross Barnett Reservoir. Ross Barnett was the most racist governor in American history, and yet there is his name on the reservoir. The federal courthouse was named after James O. Eastland. There was a James O. Eastland federal courthouse. There are more Civil War monuments in Mississippi than there are people. And it was just, the Confederate flag is, the Mississippi state flag is the Confederate battle flag. So all of these symbols are still there as civil rights appears to be growing. And I was sort of fascinated by it. And in some ways, I loved the pace of life. And I always tell this story. The first time I was there in Jackson, I was looking at some research, and I was at the airport ready to leave after my first trip. And I was waiting for a sandwich. And it was a sandwich shop in the Jackson, Mississippi airport. And the woman behind the counter was making it at a pace that could not have been slower. It was stunning. My mouth was dropping open. And I realized that my plane had pulled in and I might miss it. And in typical New York fashion, I began with the body language. Like, oh my God, what's going on here? Is she ever going to get it? And the guy right in front of me, this elderly Mississippi guy, turned to me. He could see my craziness. And he turned to me and he simply said, "Thank God she don't work for the rescue squad." And it was his way of saying, you can stand on your head and that sandwich isn't coming any faster, And there was something about Mississippi that was endearing, and I wanted to come back. So when the Sovereignty Commission files were made public, I had written quite a bit for the Times before, so I called up an editor at the magazine and said, I'd really like to go down there and see what this has to say about Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. Can we find anything in these files? And they thought that was a really good idea, so they paid my way down, and they said, if there's something in the files, then you write your story. So I brought my son Matthew down with me. He was 19 years old time, and he was a journalism student at the University of Wisconsin. I thought this would be a great bonding experience. And we were met by a photographer, a New York Times photographer, down in Mississippi. So we looked through these files, and they were unbelievable. There was no smoking gun in the files. There was nothing in the files that said the governor of Mississippi knew about these murders in advance, or that the state police had actively, taken part in it, or that they were covering it up. There was none of that. But there were a couple things that really shone through. One was the level of surveillance. It was the damnedest thing I had ever seen. In those files was a file on every single Freedom Summer worker. Every single one with a photograph, which meant that they had infiltrated every single office. I'd never seen anything like it. In those files were the pictures, descriptions, and license plate tags of every single vehicle used by civil rights workers during Freedom Summer. And they were spread around to the local police. And it was eerie to hold in your hands the piece of paper given by an informant that had the information and plate number of the station wagon that Cheney had been driving in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was just unbelievable. I mean, there was nothing that the Sovereignty Commission did not know about the Freedom Summer volunteers. The second thing is that the Sovereignty Commission had done its own investigation of the Neshoba County killings of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. And what was remarkable to me was that this guy who did the investigation, who knew these people very well and couldn't be accused of being an outsider like the FBI, this guy had come to the exact same conclusions. You know, the preacher was involved, law enforcement officials were involved, Deputy Price was involved. And I thought to myself, this is really important because it's corroboration by their own people that the killers of these civil rights workers are basically still walking the streets of Philadelphia, Mississippi. They've never been tried for murder. So what my son and I did was we realized we had to interview a number of people. The first person we interviewed was the Attorney General of Mississippi, whose name was Mike Moore. And Mike Moore was on the side of the Angels. He had a good civil rights record, and he was the guy who led the great sort of tobacco case against the big companies. Remember when various state attorney generals sued and won billions of dollars? Mike Moore was the guy who led that. So he's a smart guy. So we showed Mike Moore the information we had, and we said to him, do you think it's time to convene a grand jury to go after the guys who've never been tried for murder, particularly Preacher Killen? And Mike Moore was reluctant. And he was reluctant for a number of reasons. He said that a lot of the forensic material was gone. The bullets were gone. The clothing of the victims was gone. Fingerprints were gone. And he also said, and I found this very interesting, he said, you know, I am now prosecuting Sam Bowers, the head of the Klan, for another murder he committed in the 1960s. And Moore said, and this was a direct quote, he said, you know, when a guy kills 10 people, if you get him for one and put him away for life, it brings justice to the other 9 people. And my son and I just didn't buy that. We really thought, no, you go after the other 9 cases as well. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and you don't get away with it because the head of the Ku Klux Klan is now in jail. But what was really interesting in Mike Moore's case was that he thought he sort of understood what the white reaction would be to reopening this case. He didn't want to pick that scab at this point when he was beginning to prosecute other cases. And he clearly had a fear that a jury in Neshoba County might acquit these guys or be hung, and it would give the worst possible national sign that Mississippi had learned nothing. So I left Mike Moore's office feeling we hadn't convinced him at all, and I don't think we had. The second call I made was to Preacher Edgar Ray Killen. Killen had never given an interview, but I decided I could not leave Mississippi without calling the preacher. I called him up. His wife answered, you know, he's in the phone book. His wife answers the phone. She says, who is this? I said, it's a personal matter. I'd like to talk to the preacher. And she says, okay. And I could hear farm machinery in the background. It takes a while. Preacher gets back to the phone. And he gets on, and I tell him who I am. But here is where I still have some guilt about this. I told the preacher I was writing an article about religion in Mississippi, and I heard he was a great preacher, and I just wanted to talk to him, believing that if I told him the truth, he was going to hang up me. And he didn't hang up. And we began to talk a bit, and then the preacher said, I'll tell you what, he said, every Saturday I go for my supplies at this country store in Philadelphia. Why don't you come to the store and we'll talk? I said, fine, see you there. So Saturday comes, the photographer, my son and I go to this incredible, my wife Jane has been there, the Williams store. It's a country store that has Ralph Lauren shirts, Cole Haan shoes, and the biggest wall of Red Man tobacco and firearms I have ever seen. It has everything. There are like, slabs of bacon hanging from the ceiling. It's just amazing. So the preacher drives up, and I get out, walk over to him, shake his hand. We begin to talk, and I'm walking through the aisles as he's sort of flipping his weekly stuff. Meanwhile, his wife is in the back flipping 50-pound feed bags into the truck while the preacher's looking for good meat inside. And the preacher says, why don't you come up for supper? Why don't you, have supper with us? I look at the photographer, who is wonderful, tough as nails, and she's ready to go. And I look at my 19-year-old son, and he sort of gives me a look like, let's give it a shot. So we follow the preacher into the hills. He's driving his pickup with his wife. The three of us are behind him, and we're going higher and higher. And finally, the preacher turns off on Rock Cut Road, which is where the civil rights workers had been killed, and my heart dropped. But he then turned immediately into his driveway, so there we were. So the preacher gets out, and he's surrounded by his dogs who come running, and he says, okay, let's go into the house and let's talk religion. I realize this is going to be a difficult conversation. So I sit down, and my son Matt is sitting next to me, and as you know, I'm Jewish, and the preacher says to me, what's your religion? And I will say I had the closest thing to an out-of-body experience, and I actually heard the word Methodist come out of my mouth. I said, I was almost looking at myself saying, I just said Methodist. It was amazing. And the preacher looks at my son, and he says, what are you? And Matt, and I thought for a 19-year-old, it was the perfect retort. He said, I'm with him. And, I've thought to myself, why did I say this? It wasn't that I thought he was going to kill us, but I knew the interview would be over, and I really wanted this interview. So we began talking about a religion for a while, and the preacher's telling me, I brag on Jesus. That's what I do. I brag on Jesus. And then I slowly began to get into the killings. And the preacher, began to talk about the FBI and how they had intimidated him and, treated him badly, but that he was innocent. I'm sorry those boys got themselves killed, but I had nothing to do with it. And this house is filled with religious memorabilia and guns. And then the interview ends, and we start to go into supper. And as we go in for supper, the preacher's brother and his sister-in-law come in. And the preacher's brother, Don Killen, is the craziest person I have ever met. He looks like Rambo from First Blood. He sort of had stringy black hair, a tank top, tattoos. And my son Matt, just to make conversation with him, he said, Don, have you ever been in Vietnam? And Don looked at him and said, I don't recall. And I thought, that's something you would recall. If you'd been in Vietnam, it would be somewhere in your memory bank, So we sit down, and Don's sitting next to my son, and Don's saying, and I'll have to use the words Don used. He said, President Clinton's a queer? I thought, okay, Did Martin Luther King, he's a queer? Yeah, okay. So we start talking. The preacher suddenly becomes the preacher. He's no longer Mr. Sweetness and Light. He and Don, for the next 3 hours, go into these incredible racist rants, these hateful rants against Jews and against blacks. I never heard anything like it. And the preacher would, in the middle of a sentence, he'd say, "Do you know that lesbians lean to the left in the womb?" I'd say, "How do you know this, preacher?" And he'd say, "It's a scientific fact." And he had hundreds of these scientific facts. The Earth was 2,642 years old. Blacks evolved from mud in Africa. Slavery was a good thing. I mean, it was an absolutely astonishing evening. He never threatened us. He never threatened us. At one point, he said something like, "You know you're up on Rock Court Road where those boys got themselves killed." But he never threatened us. Finally, after about 3.5 hours of these endless, hateful rants, the preacher declares dinner over. He invites us to the Neshoba County Fair. And to get out of the house, I tell him, "Oh, we'll be there, preacher. You don't have to worry about it." And we get into our car, and it's perfectly dark outside. And we start driving down Rock Cut Road. And the photographer says, "Stop the car." I stopped the car. She said, "Turn off the lights." And she went out and took a picture and came back in and said, "That is the last thing these boys saw before they were killed. I will never forget that." And that was the picture that was in the Times, the lead picture in the Times magazine. Well, to make a long story short, we were supposed to spend the night in Philadelphia, but we decided we're heading right for the Memphis airport. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And we flew back, and I wrote the article. And in the article, at the end, I called upon the state of Mississippi to indict the preacher for murder. I thought the time had come to do this. And that was the end. There was a lot of good feedback on it, but nothing happened. And then in 2005, 7 years later, the preacher was indicted for murder in Philadelphia, Mississippi, for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Now, I will say I played an extremely small role in this. The heavy lifting, the real heavy lifting, was done by a reporter named Jerry Mitchell at the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi, and by the families of the 3 murdered workers. I did nothing after this article. They did it all. And the preacher, as some of you may know, was brought up on 3 counts of first-degree murder. I will admit that by strict legal standards, it was a case that everyone knew he did it. Everyone knew he was the mastermind behind it. But most of the witnesses were dead. So what they did was to rely on trial transcripts from the federal trial in the 1960s. They relied on a jailhouse snitch who was in the cell next to Killen, who claimed that Killen had told him he was involved in the murders, and one Meridian policeman who claimed that 20 years before Killen had told him about the murders. The jury deadlocked. The jury deadlocked on first-degree murder. The judge sent them back, and the jury unanimously came back with 3 guilty pleas for manslaughter, and the preacher was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of 20 years in prison. He's already in his 80s, which means he will spend the rest of his life at Parchman Farm in Mississippi, which to me was wonderful justice, because the book I wrote about Mississippi was about Parchman Farm, and there he was. But again, my role was very, very small. I will say one thing, however, and that is that the preacher remembers me. And the preacher thinks I played a very big role, and I'll tell you how I know this. Just after he was indicted for murder, a writer for The New Yorker named Jeff Goldberg went down to Neshoba County to try to interview the preacher. He drove up to the preacher's farm on Rock Cut Road. The preacher came out with his dogs and a shotgun and told Goldberg if he didn't get off his land, he was going to kill him. But they did have a very brief conversation. And let me quote it to you. This is Jeff Goldberg. Quote, "Killen had been more talkative a few years earlier in an interview with David Oshinsky for the Times magazine. Quote, I'm a right-winger who supports the Constitution as written by the Founding Fathers, Killen had said. When Oshinsky asked him about the murders, he replied, quote, those boys were communists who went to a communist training school. I'm sorry they got themselves killed, but I can't show any remorse for something I didn't do. Here are the sentences I love. Killen explained to me, said Goldberg, that he was wary of the press. Oshinsky, he alleged, had misinterpreted his views. Quote, I believe he's Jewish, Killen said. So it took 7 years, but he saw through that Methodist thing. In 2005, finally, a history professor and really an oracle named David Sansung at the University of Mississippi was asked whether the trial of Edgar Ray Killen would hurt Mississippi's image. And Sansung replied, I can't speak about our image, but it's going to be awfully good for our soul. Amen, and thank you.
Dr. Oshinsky, thank you very much. I think the doctor will be available for questions from anyone in the audience who would choose to raise them. There are microphones in the aisle that we would like to have you take advantage of. And please step up if you would. Yes.
I remember exactly. I remember exactly what it was. The first thing we did, I'll tell you this. The preacher made us hold hands while he said a prayer before dinner. And I remember the photographer for the New York Times snapped a photo as he was doing this. And the preacher whipped over and looked at her as if this were blasphemy. But thank God he just went on with the prayer. We had steak, French fries, and Kool-Aid. That was the meal. Steak. And what I did, it's the only thing I knew how to do since I couldn't possibly tape this, is that every half hour or so, I would excuse myself, go to the bathroom, take out a piece of paper, and frantically write down what the preacher must have thought I had a prostate problem. But I just wanted to make sure I got it accurately, but it's steak, French fries, and Kool-Aid. No dessert? Probably, but I was too traumatized to remember.
I had a question. One is, actually two questions. The first one is, what religion was the preacher, and did he try to get into any dogma issues about Methodist religion? And what religion was he?
That's a very good question. Let me answer the first, and you can ask the second. He called himself a primitive Baptist. That's what he called him, a primitive Baptist. He did not get into any Methodist questions, which was very good because I don't know anything about Methodism. Thank God. He just, when he found out I was a Methodist and my son was with me, he just went on. He just stopped and change course. I asked the question very quickly after that,
Okay.
because I didn't want to be asked about any more about it.
And the second is, what happened to Michael Shermer's wife?
Rita Schwerner remarried, became an attorney, and she's really a wonderful civil rights attorney in Seattle, Washington. And she was, in some ways, the person who just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. She's an amazing woman. And she was there every day at the preacher's trial. And I do know that she was not satisfied with the verdict. She wanted murder charges. But she understood that I think that's the best that she could get. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. I enjoyed your talk very much. I wanted to ask you this question about journalistic ethics, in case we have any journalism students around here. Obviously, the result was good. You got the information that you needed to write a great story. But what is your sense of what we can tell our interviewees in aid of getting a good story? I mean, the police can tell things to get confessions, but how do you see as a journalist?
I think that's a fair question. I am not a journalist, so I really can't speak to their ethics. What I could say from my perspective was that there are two parts of this entire process that I somehow regret. Not leveling with the preacher about exactly what I intended to do is one of them. So obviously the fact that I feel regret must mean that I am not completely comfortable with not having told him the full truth. The second problem was the following, and this in some ways I found even more disturbing. When I was looking through the Sovereignty Commission files, I came across a name of a man who the investigator, the Sovereignty Commission investigator, believed was the one who told the FBI where the bodies were buried. And he had gotten $30,000 for it, according to this. And this was supposedly the best kept FBI secret for years, because you really wanted to protect this guy. So when I found his name, I called up my editor at the Times and I said, this is not fully germane to the story, but it's really an interesting sidebar that this name that the FBI has tried to protect, and he may or may not be the source, but there he is identified as the source. What should I do? And my editor said, call him up and tell him what you found and see what he says. So I called him up. He was not happy to hear from me. It was a very brief and angry phone call on his end, and he slammed down the phone. And I called back my editor and said, this didn't go very well. What should I do? And she said, what should you do? You call him back, and you tell him you've got this information, and you're going with it, whether he likes it or not. And he can either comment or not comment. So I called him back, and that was a hard call, I'll tell you. I called him back, and he basically told me to go to hell and hung up the phone again. And we did print his name. We did print his name. And the rationale for printing his name was that, a lot of other people are going to use these sovereignty files in the coming weeks. And the first guy from the Chicago Tribune or the Washington Post is going to see the name, and they'll use it. So we might as well get it out. But I always felt that it had kind of needlessly put him at risk. And I always felt uncomfortable about that as well. I've never talked to other journalists about what the protocol is, but it did not leave a good taste in my mouth. Although I love my editor, she was fantastic.
This was a great story. If we look at the list, how many still people need to go to jail?
That is a very good question. In the case of Mississippi burning, there are about 5 living suspects, all of whom should be in jail. Now, what I will tell you and some of you may know this, is that a few years ago, Congress passed what is called the Emmett Till law. Emmett Till, as some of you may know, is a young teenager from Chicago, went down the Mississippi Delta and was murdered, and his killers got off scot-free. And it was a huge case. But in any event, what it did was to provide funds, federal funds, for cold case civil rights cases like Mississippi burning. There was an article recently in the Times that the money has not been well spent, that they have not been aggressive in prosecuting these cases. And the feeling appears to be that certainly among whites in the South, it's almost like with Nazis, that the people you're trying and sending to jail don't look or act anything like the people who committed these horrific acts. It's some 80-year-old guy, with an air hose up his nose in a wheelchair being tried. So that has, I think, caused a problem, and we have not really been aggressive enough in going after these people. And I think it would be an enormous public service for the state of Mississippi to go after every one of those remaining SOBs and send them to jail. And I don't care if they do have an air hose up their nose.
Thank you for a very interesting, memorable, and funny story. I have two questions.
Sure.
Have you gone back, and do you fear for your safety?
Okay. I was in Philadelphia, Mississippi a number of times before. I have not gone back. At one point, and only once, I think I got a call from the Meridian Police saying that there had been a threat and they had to report it, but it was something in a bar and they didn't take it seriously, and that's the last I heard. So I've gotten no threats at all. And in that sense, my greatest fear was that my son and I were going to be subpoenaed and have to testify at the trial. And that never happened, but that was what really laid on my mind. No, I have not been back. I probably would not go back to Philadelphia, Mississippi. I certainly wouldn't go back and use a credit card in Philadelphia, Mississippi. No, I would not.
Professor Oshinsky, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm just wondering, many religious leaders went to Mississippi in 1964, and I'm wondering if the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission kept records on them as well.
You can count on it.
Oh my!
And you want to know something amazing, folks? It's mainly online. Go online, look up Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, and then type in a name. Okay? I'd be willing to bet that every single religious leader who came down to Mississippi in Freedom Summer has a dossier. I'd bet my bottom dollar on it. Yes.
Amazing. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment on a couple of things. One
Sure.
is the accuracy or lack thereof of the namesake movie, which I'm sure we've all enjoyed.
Mississippi Burning?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second thing is, I vaguely recall reading a review in the New York Times about a book that claimed that one of the events...
Are you talking about Mafia?
What's
Yeah?
that?
No, I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead.
it's about the rabbi, I think it was a rabbi in Jackson, Mississippi,
Yeah.
whose home was bombed by the Klan, which gave
Right.
Bobby Kennedy the green light to send the FBI down there, or something to that effect.
I've heard the same thing, and I think there's probably some truth to that. As you know, Jack Kennedy, for all his wonderful qualities, was no great fan of an aggressive civil rights movement in the South. And Bobby had real problems when it came to protecting the Freedom Riders who came down on buses in Birmingham and Montgomery and basically had the hell beaten out of them. So by the time Freedom Summer came on, Bobby Kennedy was in a very, very protective mode, I think. And it was Bobby Kennedy, LBJ, and others who really sort of forced J. Edgar Hoover's hand. So yes, I think that would be, that is accurate. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Well, the first question was about the accuracy of the
Oh, Mississippi Burning. Okay, the Gene Hackman movie. Well, if you take the love story out of it, basically what the Mississippi burning talks about, or the plot behind it, is that the FBI, led by Hackman, was incredibly aggressive. You know, they sort of beat the crap out of suspects to find the truth and to get to the bottom of this case. I think they probably took some historical liberties in doing that, but the preacher told me that their interrogation tactics were quite harsh, that he was held for long periods of time without a lawyer, without a bathroom break, without food or water, you know, sort of slapped around a little bit. So, you know, when that kind of stuff happens to the Klan, people unfortunately have a different feeling about it than when it happens to others. I think the FBI was going to get to the bottom of this regardless of what it had to do, but rather than sort of beating the suspects senseless, it was much more paying big money to get the information that they wanted. That's really what it was. It was paid gigantic amount of money to informants. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll see you in the other room.